Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our podcast on ensuring a successful formulation and dosage form manufacturing for clinical trials. My name is Andrew Buis. I am the Senior Formulation Scientist at our CDMO site in Philadelphia, where pharmaceutical formulation, development, and manufacturing occur. I will co-host the discussion with my colleague, Kevin Kirkcaldy, who is the Director of Pharmacy Operations at Altasciences clinical site in Montreal.
Hi, Andrew, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss how Altasciences clinical and CDMO teams work in tandem to ensure the optimal dosage is manufactured in preparation for first-in-human clinical trials. Andrew can tell us about the interrelated processes between Altasciences clinical and CDMO teams and how they ensure a smooth conduct of clinical trials in this early phase of drug development.
Sure. The fact is our CDMO division can support a drug development program from as early as discovery and prototype formulation all the way through preclinical testing, clinical trials, and commercialization. What's different about us is that we are fully integrated CRO CDMO, meaning our CDMO team works in tandem with our preclinical and clinical teams throughout the entire drug development process. During the clinical phase of development, direct lines of communication are opened up between all team members to address milestones and any problems that may arise, and also to ensure a smooth transition of goals and material. This is all done under one program manager, making sure communication is constant and that any potential issues are flagged early on to avoid potential delays.
That's very true. Can you tell us a bit more about the safety testing you perform at our CDMO site and some common pitfalls that you encounter at this stage?
The first step for our CDMO team is to discuss a high level understanding of our client's goals with a particular molecule. This typically involves in depth details of what the API is and what is intended for the current phase of development and project timelines. Once we have a high level of understanding of the goals for the project, the next step is to determine the safety profile of the API and if there are any special circumstances that we need to address. If the safety profile is known, we can manufacture in our grade C or grade D suites or other safety enclosures meant to handle highly potent APIs. The biggest challenge we encounter at this stage is when the API is too potent or classified as a hormone. These types of APIs require special personal protective equipment or engineering controls to isolate the API completely. In regards to the safety testing, we outsource it to a third-party company to determine the safety profile, risk assessment, and occasional or occupational exposure limit before any hands-on work or have the client give us the information if it's readily available. Once the safety profile has been established, engineering controls are implemented to handle and properly store the API. All formulations and manufacturing work are then developed with these controls in mind. This is done in tandem with early development work for future phase 1 and phase 2 clinical needs.
Can you name a couple of manufacturing issues that you've encountered just before or during clinical trials that could have potentially impacted the program's timeline and how they were resolved?
In an ideal world, at this stage of development, there should not be any significant surprises related to the formulation or the manufacturing process. Many of the questions that arose during the pre-planning and early development work are answered as the development process unfolds. Questions such as or related to performing excipient compatibility, having robust analytical methods, and having a tried and true scalable manufacturing process. These are all tasks that come together over time. There are efficiencies to be gained throughout the process with some tweaks here and there. However, there are no shortcuts to having a quality product. In terms of challenges we encounter at this stage, there are some issues that tend to arise early on. One is the availability of the API. In many cases, the API is a recently discovered molecule or recently discovered or novel compound with limited availability and typically is very expensive. This is usually a rate limiting factor when it comes to the extent of the formulation development that is possible. Another challenge is that the potency needs to be determined for preclinical studies. We derive the potency based on solubility and experimental data available. With this information, we do our best to develop various formulations that will provide the highest concentration on an API with the API on a percent weight by weight basis to determine the maximum dosing options possible for the clinic.
That's very interesting. So it's clear that coordination and clear dialogue between the clinical and CDMO teams are critical at this stage.
Absolutely. Both teams work very closely with each other to ensure everyone is up to date with any progress being made. We do this by constant communication through weekly or bi-weekly meetings with a constant stream of emails, provide updates on milestones or roadblocks to keep everyone working within the timeline. Let's turn it over to you, Kevin, and learn a little bit more about how the CDMO team and the clinical pharmacy work together to ensure a successful completion of clinical trials. Tell us how the clinical CRO team can compound API for first-in-human participants.
Thanks, Andrew. When a sponsor has a new product that is ready to commence first-in-human trials, they often only have an API powder that needs to be compounded for subject administration. The route of administration will vary from oral solutions and suspensions to sub-Q, IM, and IV administrations. Without the first data for human trials, it's risky to invest too much in costly formulation development at this early stage. Luckily, the pharmacy can prepare the API under either USP 795 for non-sterile, USP 797 for sterile products, and also following all other local pharmacy regulatory requirements. For example, up here, Health Canada will permit a novel API to be compounded within 24 hours of IP administration. The IP powder must be made under GMP, but the compounding activities don't have to. Because of this, in some cases, Health Canada will request that different tests be performed on the prepared IPs, so usually sterility, endotoxin, and concentration testing. When this is required, the pharmacy needs to prepare mock preparations and have them analyzed. The results need to be submitted to Health Canada with the CTA application and can add delays to the timeline. That's where our manufacturing team comes in. So the question for you, Andrew, is how could the CDMO process under GMP accelerate this step?
We can perform the compounding of the API in our grade C suites ISO 7 and grade D ISO 8 suites based on the pharmacy needs. While these are not sterile rooms, we can prepare the product under best clean conditions and ship the pre-sterilized product out for terminal sterilization, repackaging into the final packaging configuration, and retest them. Product release testing involves microbial and endotoxin testing. Testing will also be provided along with appearance assay, impurities, and dissolution testing. So, Kevin, getting back to the clinical side of things, how do you overcome challenges in coordinating the labeling process to respect Health Canada's guidelines and in determining the appropriate quantities of IMP to prepare and then import the IMP?
That's a good question. Prior to study start, it's really important to address these issues because they can have an impact on the study down the road. Our pharmacy team, through the project manager, will get in touch with the sponsor and provide the required quantities, confirm if retention samples are needed, review the labels, and even provide the French translation for Health Canada labeling requirements. We also provide the timelines for the IP shipment versus the NOL reception, which is required for Canadian studies. And we also have a broker that assists us in ensuring timely customs release of the IP. When the sponsor is working with a third party to provide the IP, it can be challenging to coordinate all these activities and avoid delays. It can also put a lot of pressure on the sponsor because they'll need to follow up with the third party and be the go-between to ensure that everything is done on time. When using Altasciences CDMO, our PM oversees all of these activities and is aware of the time-sensitive requirements and critical path, which really harmonizes the whole process and prevents delays. Our pharmacy team is really used to working in tandem with the CDMO, so we can be more agile and better adapt to changes in study design and requirements. This permits us to support the entire process and removes a lot of the stress from the sponsor.
Can you give us some examples of operational challenges at the pharmacy in getting the proper documentation for the study?
Well, all companies have their own internal procedures and way of doing things. Depending on who's preparing the IP for the study, there can be different and sometimes unforeseen challenges that can arise. For example, we had a CDMO that used the same lot number for the active test and placebo. You can imagine that having identical looking tablets with the same lot number can be a bit problematic. And naturally, the test COA has its own specific lot number, which is the same thing for the placebo will have another lot number on its COA. The problem is that they'll both be different than what appears on the bottled label. In this scenario, the pharmacy team has no way to link the COA's lot number with the lot number on the package. So we need to go back to the sponsor to request documentation that will link both of them together. This confirmation usually comes back as a certificate of compliance or a sponsor memo. Since our CDMO colleagues have the expertise in clinical trials and work closely with us, we can really ensure that the labeling and supporting documentation meets all of the clinical trial requirements. In the past, we've also had issues with getting extended stability data for IPs during the trial conduct, which can cause problems. These situations are easily avoidable with the proper oversight and with the coordinated efforts of Altasciences PM, pharmacy, and CDMO all working together. We can really ensure that this doesn't happen and it doesn't cause any delays in dosing. I'd have one last question for you, Andrew. As you may know, pharmacy operations may require IPs to be prepared in advance and may need extra stability data, such as stability in PVC IV lines and polypropylene vials versus ADPE vials, and stability of our prepared IV doses. How does our CDMO team coordinate with our clinical team to determine the required information and ensure optimal study conduct?
Great question, Kevin. Early on in the development process, the clinical team will communicate the desired primary packaging components for the prepared doses. This information will be built into the stability protocol. The stability protocol will include, but is not limited to, the primary packaging and any kind of material that the product will touch as part of the drug delivery. The product will be exposed to these components and placed on stability for an agreed upon timeline, typically at standard conditions of 5 degrees Celsius or 25 degrees Celsius at 60% humidity, and accelerated conditions at 40 degrees Celsius at 75% humidity. When the material is pulled at these specific times, we test the product for appearance, drug assay, related substances, purity, moisture content, dissolution, and microbial growth. We then analyze this data and determine if the packaging or delivery components are affecting the compound at all. This information is then conveyed to the clinical team. Well, I think that wraps things up, Kevin. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our listeners. I'm sure that all these tips will help our audience during their early drug development. For any questions, you can contact us directly using the email address on the screen.
Thank you all for listening. Be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, and videos on Altasciences webinars and podcast channel. Talk soon.